in order to reveal to the foolish leadership of the Social Democrats in Germany the true nature of the imperial system which had created the present crisis of world war, Luxembourg documents the behavior of the British Empire, controlling large segments of the planet through a system of international loans, using as a case study the economic events spanning the 20 years leading up into the occupation of Egypt by the British in 1882. When the British-sponsored Confederacy seceded from the Union, sparking the American Civil War in the 1860s, the price of cotton, which had been the primary cash crop of the southern United States, began to hyperinflate, increasing in price by almost 1,000% by the end of the war. With the supply from America interrupted, the British turned their eyes towards Egypt. A fever of speculation on cotton as a commodity was unleashed on Egypt, with massive loans coming from England to finance its cultivation. Diving into the bubble headlong, soon almost the entire territory of Egypt was brought under the cultivation of cotton. As Luxembourg describes it, everybody was planting cotton, including the Viceroy of Egypt himself. His estates grew fat, forcibly appropriating land from the peasants without any legal excuse. Within an incredibly short time, all of Egypt's farms were planted with cotton. But this bubble in the price of cotton collapsed in the following year, crashing by half in just a couple of days, and finally losing almost the entirety of its value once the American Civil War was completed. As quickly as it had begun, the cotton bubble was over. However, along came a new fever of speculation, now in sugarcane, to replace it. For a second time, Luxembourg says, Egyptian agriculture was turned upside down. The peasants were driven to forced labor on the sugar plantations in the thousands. Factories and transport for the sugar had to be built. The money for this construction was supplied by loans from British banks in 1872. But it proved to be simply impossible to supply enough cane and enough labor to support the financial bubble. The working staff was completely inadequate, since the peasants, accustomed to forced labor on the land, could not be transformed by the lash of a whip into industrial workers overnight. The venture collapsed even before many of the imported machines had been installed, thus ending the sugar speculation just as quickly as the cotton gamble had ended just a few years before. What had provided the capital for these enterprises? The capital, Luxembourg says, came from international loans. The first of these loans was floated in 1865 by the Anglo-Egyptian Bank. As this loan and others came due, the cotton bubble had collapsed. To consolidate this debt, which was now unpayable, another loan was issued in 1868. The sugar gamble necessitated another loan in 1870. Two more loans came in 1872 and 1873, but none of these were repayable. Finally, by 1874, Egypt's total public debt had grown from 3 million British pounds to 94 million, and, as Luxembourg says, collapse was imminent.
These operations of capital at first sight seemed to reach the height of madness. One loan followed hard on the other. The interest on old loans was defrayed by new loans, and capital borrowed from the British and French paid for the large orders placed with British and French capital. While the whole of Europe sighed and shrugged its shoulders at Egypt's crazy economy, European capital was in fact doing business in Egypt on a unique and fantastic scale. There was an element of usury in every loan, anything between 1/5 and 1/3 of the money ostensibly lent sticking to the fingers of the European bankers. Ultimately, the exorbitant interest had to be paid somehow. But how? Where were the means to come from?
From the peasants, from their land, from their labor, working on the cotton plantations, working in the sugar plants, all without pay, switched over from one job to the next as the need arose. The greater the European debt became, the more had to be extorted from the peasants. All over Egypt, people were leaving their villages, demolishing their dwellings, no longer tilling their land, all to avoid the payment of the exorbitant taxes that had been placed on their heads. 10,000 Egyptian peasants are said to have starved in 1 year because, No longer being able to come up with the money for the irrigation tax for their fields, they had killed all of their cattle to avoid paying it. Eyewitness newspaper reports of the conditions in Egypt at that time documented, "People are starving by the roadside. Great tracts of country are uncultivated. The farmers have sold their cattle, and the usurers are filling the mortgage offices with their bonds and the courts with their suits of foreclosure." The peasant was drained of his last drop of blood. Used as a leech by British capital, the Egyptian state had accomplished its function and was no longer needed. Now, British commissions to regulate the finances of Egypt went into action. Strangely enough, European capital was not at all deterred by the desperate state of the insolvent country and offered again and again to grant immense loans for the salvation of Egypt. The country and all of her productive forces was to become the prey of European capital. October 1878 saw the representatives of the European creditors landing in Alexandria. British and French capital established dual control of the finances and devised new taxes. The peasants were beaten and oppressed so that payment of interest to the banks, temporarily suspended one year for lack of revenue, could be resumed in the next. Now, the claims of European capital became the pivot of economic life and the sole consideration of the financial system. In 1879, all of the finances of the country of Egypt were brought under the permanent control of European capital. Finally, an opportune pretext for the final blow was provided by a mutiny in the Egyptian army starved under European financial control, and by a revolt engineered among the Alexandrian masses who had been bled to the bone. The British military occupied Egypt in 1882. The military occupation was merely the enforcing arm of the debt collectors on the international loans. Militarism, Luxemburg says, is merely the executor of the accumulation of capital lurking behind international loans. The ultimate and final step had been reached in the process of liquidating the peasant economy in Egypt by and for the empire's capital.
It should now be clear that the transactions between European loan capital and European industrial capital are based upon relations which are extremely rational and sound for the accumulation of capital, although they appear absurd to the casual observer, because this loan pays for the orders from Egypt, and the interest on one loan is paid out of a new loan. Stripped of all obscuring connecting links, these relations consist in the simple fact that European capital has largely swallowed up the Egyptian peasant economy. Enormous tracts of land, labor, and labor products without number, accruing to the state as taxes, have ultimately been converted into European capital and have been accumulated.